Your grandparents bought their house with a few years of pay. You would need most of a working life to buy the same house. And here is the strange part. The house itself barely changed. Same walls, same roof, same small yard. So, what got so expensive? Look at this house. Plain walls, a simple roof, a small yard out front. Nothing about it is grand. And yet, this ordinary little house sits at the center of one of the strangest puzzles of modern life. The walls are the same. The roof is the same. The little yard is the same. But across 2 generations, 2 families paid wildly different prices for it. The building barely moved. The price went somewhere extraordinary. Here is the strange part. The bricks did not get more expensive in any way that explains this. Most of the rise came from something underneath it, the land it stands on, and the simple fact that there was never going to be enough of it. Picture the grandfather. One working man, one income, a steady job. He walks up to this front door and buys the whole place with about 2 or 3 years of normal wages. Not a fortune, just a few years of ordinary pay. That was the deal in the years after the war. A house was something a single paycheck could reach. You worked, you saved for a short while, and the door was yours. Now, cut forward. Same street, same house. Standing in front of it is the grandchild. And for this young person, buying that identical home would swallow most of an entire working life of earnings. Not 2 or 3 years. Decades. The same 4 walls now demand the bulk of everything a person can earn between their first job and their last. That is the gap that should stop us cold. Same building, different fate. So here is the riddle that will drive everything that follows. The timber barely changed. The bricks barely changed. So what, exactly, got so expensive? In this story, we are going to follow the money and find out. When the Second World War ended, millions of young men came home at once, ready to marry, ready to settle, ready to start their lives. They needed somewhere to live, and there were almost no houses for them. For the first time, owning your own home stopped being a far-off dream. It became something ordinary millions of people could actually reach. But to understand how, we have to go back a few years, to a quiet change almost nobody noticed. In 1934, in the middle of the Great Depression, the government created something called the Federal Housing Administration. It was not glamorous. It was a set of rules. But those rules would reshape how a whole country bought its homes. Before this, a home loan was short and frightening. You needed a large amount of cash up front, and you had to repay the rest in just a few years. The new rules let banks lend for a long time, and the government promised to cover the bank if the buyer failed to pay. End quote. That single change quietly removed the fear. A bank could now lend to an ordinary worker without worrying it would lose everything. So the door to ownership, once shut to most families, slowly swung open. Then, in 1947, on potato fields in New York, a company called Levittown Sons had a wild idea. They would build houses the way Henry Ford built cars, fast, identical, and cheap, on cheap land at the edge of town. There was no single factory. The factory was the street itself. Crews moved house to house, each team doing one job, and only that job, then moving on. A finished home could rise in a single day. The middle-class home, mass-produced. For a young family, it felt almost too good to be true. A real house, a yard, a key of their own. And it was about to get bigger still, because a new kind of loan was coming that would stretch the dream further than anyone imagined. Here is the first surprise. The 30-year mortgage was not some old tradition handed down through the centuries. It was a decision. In 1948, the United States Congress had to sit down and formally allow this long loan for newly built homes. 6 years later, in 1954, lawmakers stretched that same long loan to cover older homes too. So the thing that feels permanent and normal today was actually written into law, line by line, by people who chose 30 years on purpose, and it spread slowly. Even into the mid-1950s, most home loans were far shorter. Between 1,946 and 1,954, the average loan still ran only about 21 years. The long 30-year loan was new, and for most families, still rare. But here was the quiet magic of stretching a loan out longer. Spread the same debt over more years, and each monthly payment shrinks. Suddenly, the same family, on the same wages, could afford a bigger house than before. By the early 1960s, this had become the American default. The 30-year fixed loan was now the way the country bought homes, supported by new institutions, Fannie Mae and later Freddie Mac, that stood quietly behind the banks. Now watch closely, because here is the part nobody noticed. When a loan costs less to carry each month, people do not pay less for a house. They borrow more. They reach for the bigger home, the higher price, because the monthly number still fits. This is the hook to hold on to. The longer the loan, the more a buyer can ask for. Cheaper each month, but a larger total. A door that swung open for millions also quietly raised the ceiling on what people would pay. So the 30-year loan was praised everywhere as the thing that made homes affordable. And in those years, it truly did. But folded inside it was a hidden flaw nobody had priced in yet, waiting patiently for the right moment to show itself. Picture the year 1981. A family walks into a bank ready to buy, and the loan officer tells them the interest rate is almost 16, even 18%. The monthly payment is so large, it stops them cold. Across the country, buyers were simply frozen out. The houses were there, the jobs were there. But the cost of borrowing was so high that ordinary couples turned around and walked away, renting another year, waiting for something to change. And then, slowly, it did change. From that peak, mortgage rates began a long descent, falling, step by step, year after year, decade after decade. Each small drop went almost unnoticed, yet each one quietly handed the next buyer a little more power. Here is the second half of the mechanism. We saw that a longer loan shrinks the payment. A lower rate does the same thing from another direction. When rates fall, that same monthly payment can finance a far bigger loan. So falling rates meant rising borrowing power. The family did not feel richer. Their wages had not jumped, but the bank would now hand them a much larger sum for the exact same payment they could already afford. The descent ran all the way down to its bottom. In early January of 2021, the average 30-year rate touched just 2.65%. It was the cheapest money in American history for buying a home. From the buyer's seat, this felt like a gift. With money this cheap, a family could afford a far larger loan than their parents ever dreamed of. And almost everyone reached the same conclusion at the same moment. But here is the missing piece. All this borrowing power needed somewhere to go. Millions of buyers, each carrying the biggest budget of their lives, were now chasing houses, and the supply of houses was about to fail them completely. Here was the other half of the story. While the size of every buyer's budget kept growing, the number of new houses being built barely moved at all. The money grew fast, the houses did not, and it was not because the country had run out of room. The problem was the rules. Zoning laws decided what could be built and where. And on most land near good jobs, you simply were not allowed to build very much. On the best land, near the best work, the answer was almost always no. No tall buildings. No small lots. One single house per large plot. So the land closest to the jobs stayed locked, and buildable land stayed scarce. Think back to the builders who once raised a whole town in a single year, one finished house every 16 minutes. That kind of speed was over. You could no longer find the cheap, open, unregulated land that made it possible. The empty fields at the edge of town were already houses now. or farms protected by law, or land where building was simply forbidden. The factory line that once stamped out homes had nowhere left to run. So now, the trap was almost shut. Millions of families, each one able to borrow more than any generation before them, all reaching for houses, and the supply of houses could not grow to meet them. Cheap money was pouring toward a fixed number of doors, and when there is more money than there are houses, that extra money does not vanish. It has only one place left to go. It goes straight into the price. Too much money, too few homes. Everything was now in place. For the moment the whole story had been building toward the moment the price of an ordinary house broke loose and climbed past the reach of an ordinary life. Here is the answer the whole story has been building toward. When money is cheap and easy to borrow, but the houses cannot multiply, that cheap credit does not make homes cheaper. It makes them more expensive. Picture two families wanting the same house. Each one walks in holding a larger loan than buyers ever held before. So they bid against each other, raising their offers until the price climbs all the way up to meet the borrowing power they brought with them. And here is the trick worth watching closely. That extra money never went into the structure. The same bricks, the same timber, the same roof cost roughly the same to build as they always did. The money flowed somewhere else. It poured into the land beneath the house and into the simple fact that there were not enough houses to go around. You were no longer paying for the home. You were paying for the scarcity it sat on. The numbers leave no doubt about where the pressure bit hardest. Through the 2010s, the cheapest entry-level homes climbed far faster than anything else. The very homes first-time buyers needed rose the most, while bigger move-up homes lagged well behind. So the irony of the 30-year mortgage comes full circle. The very tool celebrated for making homes affordable helped lift prices, because by shrinking the monthly payment, it let more and more buyers qualify for higher and higher prices. Stated plainly, cheap credit plus too little building equals a rising price on the same old house, the unchanged walls your grandparents bought for a few years of wages. And then money grew expensive again. By the mid-2020s, the average 30-year mortgage rate had climbed back above 6%. But the high prices, baked in by decades of cheap money, did not fall back. Buyers were now squeezed from both sides at once. So the grandchild stands on the same sidewalk, looking at the same walls, the same roof, and finally sees it clearly. The walls and roof were never the expensive part. You are not really buying the bricks. You are buying the patch of ground under them and the decades of cheap borrowing baked into the price. And that gives you a new way to read any home price. The real question was never how pretty the kitchen is or how new the paint looks. The real question is simpler and harder. How scarce is the land underneath it, and how cheap is the money used to buy it? 2 generations apart, the building barely moved. The same small yard. The same front door. What moved was everything beneath it. The land grew scarce, and the money grew loose. The house stood still. The world's money and its land moved silently around it, and that quiet motion, not the bricks, is what now costs a lifetime of wages. So when a young person today cannot afford the house their grandparents bought with ease, it is not because the house got better or bigger. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. There is always another one worth telling.